Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. Today, we're delighted to welcome Rick Steinke, who we are so excited to hear you share your wisdom with us today. Rick, how are you doing?
Doing great, Roland. Thank you very much. And Craig, and I appreciate the invite for today.
And of course, we wouldn't be here without that gentleman, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland, and thanks for joining us, Rick. So today we want to talk about thrillers, and you're somebody who's written a bunch of them, and they're doing well, and you seem to have it all figured out. But
that part, but I'm doing
it
book by book, maybe a little bit better, hopefully, but.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, everybody's at a different stage for that, right? But that's why we do this, is everyone can learn something from each other, and I'm sure you've figured out some things that other people haven't. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and your series and how that all got started? Then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, I professionally I was a U.S. Army officer for 28 years, graduated from West Point, got commissioned into the Cold War and served, loved leading soldiers, spent half my time overseas, commanded a battalion of multiple launch rockets at one point in NATO, the last one that was left there on the U.S. side, and ended up being the U.S. Defense Attaché to France for my last assignment, the senior U.S. Defense representative to France. I replaced a two-star Air Force general at the time. I was a colonel because a certain Secretary of Defense was not exactly enamored with our colleagues and where you're sitting, I think, Roland, right now in Paris. But anyway, so that's how that all worked out. And then I went from there to serve at a place called the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, and it's in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, and it is a German-American partnership for fighting transnational organized crime, terrorism, cyber threats, all the big national security threats, working with government agencies literally around the world to take on those challenges. And that's what I kind of did the professional side up until about 5 years ago. I'm married, got 2 kids, very, very thankful for that. And picked up this new gig, to do something, let's say, besides go fly fishing all the time. Which is great here in Utah where I live. And started down the road about, when was it? 2017. I wrote a memoir about my time in Paris called Next Mission U.S. Defense Attaché to France. And it did fairly well. And but I had to get that book cleared by like 8 U.S. government agencies and departments before I could publish it. It took about 6 months to do that. And there was a lot more that I wanted to say about that kind of service, about being a military attaché, about working internationally with law enforcement, with diplomats, with military people. And so I said, you know what, I'm gonna try this thriller thing. So I took 3 master classes, James Patterson, Dan Brown, and Ken Follett, and got going with those and learned a thing or two, and made my first big jump into the briar patch, if you will, with Major Jake Forina and the Tier 1 threat. And it's based in Paris, oddly enough. I don't know if Roland's got the Eiffel Tower, I think right behind him right there. It's kind of where it starts. And my protagonist is a U.S. Army officer. He's not the next George Patton or Bernard Montgomery or Horatio Nelson. He's not going to be one of those guys, but he's a dedicated U.S. Army officer who finds himself in a sort of a diplomatic and intelligence role, and he's faced with a very serious so-called Tier 1 national threat not long after arriving in Paris, and the story starts from there. So that's kind of how I got going.
Well, I'll tell you what, you've sold me on it. I want to.
Thank you.
I have this background because I used to live and work in Paris, and my parents live in France. So now I'm very interested to read that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a very interesting career, and it's always interesting to read books that are based on that sort of thing. You know, I imagine these are still fiction, though, right?
These are fiction.
Right.
I did have a different career, by the way. It was a very international career. After about the time I reached the rank of major, served with Italian mountain troops and did some other crazy stuff. But I served in Afghanistan later on too for the Marshall Center. But yeah, it was very different. But I would say, Craig and Roland, that, you know, roughly half to 2/3 of the books I write are places I've been to, meetings I've been in, incidents I've been in, that sort of stuff. I try to pull that sort of thing in there, my understanding of the sort of political military world that's out there to the degree I can. And the rest is Hollywood, quite frankly. And it's the Hollywood that I try to almost tear from the headlines. So the first book is about a virus that an enemy is going to deploy, that wants to deploy against the United States, Israel, and Jews around the world. But first, vaccinate their own people. And that's kind of where that one starts rolling. And it starts rolling in a cemetery right in Paris, in Suresnes, the World War I American cemetery that's there. And that's where that gets started. So that's that one. The second one, imagine this, is about a Russian oligarch who is in Italy, who had his, he's a super wealthy guy, oligarch by definition is, who had his yacht impounded by the Italian authorities. That's a true story. But who wants to go back to the Kremlin and be worse than the guy that's in there now? And who will be more threatening against Europe than the guy that's in there now? So that's how that one kind of got rolling. And then I've got a third book called Change of Mission, which is based on my personal experiences being deployed to patrol against the mafia when I was with the Italian mountain troops in southern Italy in the early 1990s. And then the fourth book, Vital Mission, is about the abduction of over 20,000 children from the rubble and the streets of Kyiv, and not Kyiv necessarily, but certainly some of the cities that are along the borders of Russia and that have been abducted basically back into Russia. So that's that story. Based on, and I worked with the Ukrainian government for 3 years as the Marshall Center's co-representative and working with their parliament and their general staff and their Ministry of Defense and things like civilian oversight of the military and all this kind of stuff between 2016 and 2018, roughly. So try to bring in some experience, try to bring in some real world stuff, try to keep the books as authentic as possible, and try to weave a good story, if you will.
All of this is so topical. I mean, tier one threat, you've got to think like how much of that was inspired by what happened with COVID, and then what's going on in the Ukraine. I mean, that's actual documented fact that for some reason we don't talk about very much, like how the Russians are literally pulling up, generations of Ukrainian children and moving to I heard they were moving them to Vladivostok, and we're not talking about that. That is just like stealing an entire generation of children.
It's stunning. It's shocking, 21st century stuff. I mean, it is, and it's confounding to a degree. And if you ever get to see the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol, which is actually the start of the war, let's not make any mistake about who started this war. Hello. You'll get a feeling for that. And of course, and that's where my opening scenes take place as well.
So I love that. I think one of the most important things about fiction is that it is a snapshot of a period in time, talking about the things that are important. Like I love James Bond, and so many of those are period talking about the Cold War and real things. So I absolutely celebrate the fact that you're writing these books that are so rooted, because at some point future generations are going to look back and read it and be like, oh wow, I didn't know this stuff was going on, and then they'll discover the real history and have an insight that perhaps society has quietly brushed under the carpet.
Completely agreed, Roland. I'm a huge Bond fan as well, and always have been. It's good stuff. Thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think that with thrillers especially, you can really get to the nitty-gritty of what's happening in the world, because it's often, when you look at it in a global stage, there's often some big things happening that can, if you drill into the little stories within them, you can turn them into thrillers. And it's much easier to do that than, if you did it with romance, or if you do it with sci-fi or fantasy,
right.
You're changing things too much, right?
And by the way,
really...
there's a little romance in this too. There are other storylines. Jake he's not the kind of guy, as one of the reviewers said, that's going to walk through a door and kill 30 guys in one go. But he also adds he's much more powerful than that. So, but this is a guy that's got actual internal problems he's got to deal with. He's got personal tragedies he's got to work through. He's a real Joe, and at least I try to make him that way. He's a guy of faith and so forth. And so, yeah, he's not classic, let's say, in that sense.
Yeah, and sorry, Roland.
I always joke that to a certain extent, authors like yourself, and Jack Carr is a big one as well, have kind of like ruined thrillers, because it used to be people like Lee Child would write them, and Lee Child is a fantastic writer, sure, but he's just a television writer. Whereas you guys have actually lived and experienced these things, and you bring an authenticity to it that really other authors can't even approach.
Indeed, and when I write the fiction as well, I sometimes realize I have to be careful of crossing a classified line. So I'll go out and I'll look and I'll see what's out there about this topic. For example, if I'm talking about a suitcase special weapon, nuclear weapon, if you will, there's a lot of junk out there about all that stuff. And, all the big problem with the Soviet Union, for example, at the end of the 1990s. And, well, I know a lot about it. I got to make sure that everybody else can know a lot about it too, if they don't already, because it's already out there. You know what I'm saying? So it's that sort of thing where I've got to be quite careful and always try to do that.
That's interesting. You have to actually, you have too much information. You have to check yourself to make sure you aren't leaking anything.
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely.
That's sort of the opposite of what most people, the issue they would have, where you have to research everything and just sort of rely on what's out there. How important do you think it is for a thriller writer specifically to have that sort of background? Because I think most thrillers, they're not all military thrillers, but right, there's aspects of a thriller that they're often international. There's travel, sure, there's weaponry, there's there's all these things where somebody who's just sitting around in their house, are they going to, and they don't have a lot of that experience, are they going to be able to really give a thriller what it needs to give that authenticity that we talk about?
I think it's very, very helpful, but I wouldn't say that it's an absolute. For example, that you have to have had it, because there are some extremely talented people out there who can talk to the right people, who can glean the right information, who can walk right up to the line, and maybe not necessarily have that kind of experience, but the research has been so in depth and they're so able to translate it into stuff that we would say, okay, I could see where that would happen. I'm thinking of like a Ken Follett, or I'm thinking of a Tom Clancy, for example, who didn't have all that much experience, but my goodness, he wrote Red October and some of these other great books where he was just that talented, I think, in terms of being able to put pen to paper. So it helps, no question. It clearly helps. It helps you get the feeling, but at the same time, I think if you don't have which is why I took the master classes, if you don't have, let's say, some degree of knowledge about the craft itself, about how to put together a good story and how to write a good sentence, a good paragraph, how to know when too much is too much and all that kind of stuff, then you won't get there from here either. You could be somebody who's lived the life of a James Bond, but if you can't learn what's necessary to put down a good story, then you're not going to get there from here either. So it's, I think somewhere in the middle, there's a meeting of people who can make it happen.
Now you say that learned how to tell a good story, and you mentioned earlier you'd taken 3 of the master classes: Dan Brown, Ken Follett, and James Patterson. Yes, and sir. So I find that fascinating, because I don't think enough people credit the fact that writing a book you have to learn how to do it. It's people think, oh, writing's easy because I write for school, I write for this. It's like, no, to write a book and make it a satisfying story, you actually need these things. So how valuable were those? What did you learn from them?
Hugely valuable. I started out with James Patterson, so I would say my style probably more mimics his, but the other two authors were also very valuable because I learned other things from them as well. But, I would say I don't want to overstate this, but if you can learn to write a good, I sound like my high school English teacher now, probably, a good sentence and a good paragraph and a good short chapter that tells a little bit of a story in and of itself, maybe not the whole story. If you could start just with that, then you're kind of on your way, but you have to have those building blocks. And from Patterson, I learned there's different, by the way, there's two different writers out there. You all have probably heard this. You've got the planners and you've got the pantsers.
That was going to be the question I was going to ask you.
Yeah. Patterson is an absolute planner. He writes a 50-page outline by hand to this day. He writes them all on a legal pad and 50 pages. And then he writes his story, which will be a piece of cake after that. Once you do that, you take a guy like, I suppose if I can skip, I don't know about Follador, because I know Follador's quite a planner as well. But Stephen King, he's a pantser. Big. You guys had a guy on here last week. He was amazing. J.D. Barker.
Yes.
He's amazing. He did a pantsing thing, if you can believe this. He told me about this because I was blessed to meet him about a year ago at a book conference in Washington. He did a thing with James Patterson whereby he wrote the first paragraph. The first chapter. He sent that chapter to Patterson, asked Patterson to write the next chapter. Patterson sent it back. That's a pantser way to do stuff, like, hey, let me just think about this sort of general vector, and I'm going to start writing. And I think I'm kind of in the middle, but I'm probably more of a planner in that I'll try to see, when I wrote the first 3 books, I would write like 50 scenes in my head, but just 1 sentence or 2 sentences max. And that's my outline. And then for that particular scene is where I would write the chapter and I would roll from there. And you have to adjust as you go along. You can sometimes maybe almost paint yourself into a corner and go, oops, I don't want to go there because how do I get out of that hole? I got to go left, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
I mean, that's the whole thing about being a pantser over a plotter is I personally am more of a plotter, and my fear is exactly that. As a pantser, you end up writing yourself into a corner and then having to figure yourself out and then having to rewrite things or come up with something ridiculous to get yourself out of it.
Oh, indeed. Absolutely. Been there. Yeah. Absolutely.
And like you're just describing Patterson doing 50 pages of outline, basically. I mean, that to me is perfect. Like that's the best way to do it, in my opinion.
That's a roadmap, right? Yeah, the book's a piece of cake after that, quite frankly. So it makes a lot of sense. It takes a lot of discipline, though, too. At the end of the day.
Well, I mean, in the way I look at it is like, you do that, but along the way, if things change, I'm not thinking to myself, oh, I can't change from this roadmap at all. If as I'm writing something diverges that I think is better, I'm fine doing that. Although I would probably go and rewrite the rest of my roadmap before I continued much further to make sure that it all still works out. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on how fixated you are on that initial thing, and it's probably more efficient to stick to it. But I'm not always as confident that original idea I had was the best one. I might come up with something better. So do you find that you're plotting to that level, or you have your own sort of technique?
I think my approach is sort of start with the idea, the big idea, where we're at, what the threat's going to be, what the kind of who the players will be, if you will, who's working with who's threatening who, and all that kind of stuff. And then if I could get through a good opening sort of series of events, that's key, and that are authentic, and that sound like, okay, that could happen. and the middle part's usually not the hardest part. And then tying that all together to make a finale, if I can get there, then that helps. So I'm like I said, even though I'll end up, because Patterson will do this, 60 or 70 small chapters from 3 to 5 pages each. If I can write 40 to 50 scenes in terms of an overall progression, then I'm well on my way. I'm well on my way.
I think I love that. That's one of the things I've learned from the James Patterson in particular, with this whole idea of scenes. And you do start to think like, oh, when you're writing a story, it's almost like a movie. You have these scenes, and these scenes have to have a particular goal to accomplish. And then you might only have 30 of those scenes, but by the time you put them in order, then the rest kind of fill themselves in. Indeed.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you can see it, if you can actually see what you're trying to write about, and I'm blessed to be able to do that, then I can typically, get stuff rolling where people will be able to visualize it as well and relate to it.
It shows an absolute professionalism, though, to be like, I'm going to write a book and then say, I need to learn how to do this. That's the kind of thinking that so many people just skip. They're just like, oh, I can do it. So there we go.
Maybe, I don't know, if years of training and schooling and everything else, in my background is, we used to have an old thing in the Army called crawl, walk, run. You gotta start out with the basics, and then you just go from there. So
I guess you don't toss some of the keys to an Abrams tank and be like, you'll figure it out.
Right. Indeed. Exactly.
You said that one of the other ones you watched was Dan Brown. Was that right?
Dan Brown. Yeah. I took his thing. I'm trying to remember. He had 2 or 3 things he kept harping on. And I want to say it was more like the tension aspect of how to build tension, within the book, and how to keep people interested, and sort of not making your writing, not to say that Patterson does or Follett does, but too linear. So you always got to figure out, okay, how do I introduce something new here without making this too predictable? I mean, that's the bane of what I try to fight, because if I'm a movie watcher, I'll drive my wife crazy, which I'm quite capable of doing, by saying this is going to happen next, or that's going to happen next, and then it does, and you're like, well, hell, I could have written that. It's just, so you want it to be able to, surprise people from time to time, keep them interested, and not drive them where they think they're going, and then change signs on them and take them somewhere else.
Yeah, I remember there's some advice about, I don't know who came up with it or what exactly it was, but the gist of it was something like, when you're writing this stuff, and the first idea or the first few ideas that come to your mind, throw those out, because that's going to be the most obvious, and that's what everyone else is going to sort of guess, right?
Sure.
And it sounds like that's sort of what you're talking about, right?
Indeed. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's you have to be a bit bold about it, and you got to have a dose of, I wouldn't say courage, but you got to take some chances with that. And here's the thing, guys, and this probably quite well. I don't know how you think you've written something pretty decent, but you really don't know until people will lay their eyes on it and come back to you and say, yeah, it is decent, or it's not, or, that sort of thing. You just don't know how. I never assumed that my book is going to whatever. Wow. These folks, because someone else, the other folks have an opinion, and it counts, so. Well,
to that end, do you end up sending your book out to beta readers, or to people in the industry, or other thriller writer authors to find out whether or not, you're on the mark, whether, especially at the beginning, when you had written your first book, I imagine.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. A few readers that have lived in this realm, for sure. Like I have a few friends that served as attachés in different places around the world. I have one good friend who was defense attaché to Israel. He was defense attaché to Morocco. I have another one who served in Norway. I mean, there are other guys that have been, doing these sorts of this sort of job sort of thing, and who understand, okay, Rick, this is, this could happen, or no, this is a bit of a stretch. And so, yeah, that's quite helpful to be able to do that.
Yeah. especially with this sort of topic. That's those people to fact check you or to
Indeed.
But even for the writing side of it, because you had never written before, you did these master classes. Did you send it off for sort of writing advice as well?
You know what I did? I sent the first 10 or so chapters out, especially to one individual who published about 10 books and who was quite successful. And he gave me a couple of thoughts about how I could maybe mix it up a little bit. One of them, which had to do with something that would sort of shake up a scene, if you will. I don't want to get into detail about it because it's in the book, obviously. And that was quite helpful. That was very helpful, actually. So I would say certainly if someone's starting out the first time around the block, I would do that. And I've had other people do that to me. And I've been very forthcoming about what I think, in terms of what they're doing. I had a dear friend who sent something to me that was much more on the sci-fi side, which is not my genre, but I thought, if you're going to write about this, it was about almost like mechanical soldiers or something, or robotic soldiers. If you're going to write about something like that, you're going to have to get folks to either suspend animation or suspend belief, or think that this could be something that could actually happen. You're going to have to draw that bridge. You're going to have to draw that connection for them, because if they don't believe that, then the book's probably going in the bin after the first 2 chapters.
I don't know. I've seen those little Boston Dynamic dogs with the guns on the back. I'm like, I could quite happily believe in
right.
robot soldiers at the moment.
There you go.
These days, yeah.
Exactly.
I think going back to what you were saying about, with Patterson, and I know from Dan Brown, I've read a lot of his back in the day. I haven't recently, but those short chapters, and often I know, at least with Dan Brown, each one almost ends on a cliffhanger of its own.
Yes.
And that just keeps the readers turning pages, and
Big deal.
keep up at night, because you can't. You're like, oh, I'll read one more chapter, and then one more, because I need to know what happened. Oh wait, one more, and then all of a sudden it's 3 a.m.
Extremely efficient writer. Absolutely no doubt about it. It keeps pushing the story forward. He emphasizes that time and time again. And then I also read, by the way, you may have heard about this. When was it? Late 90s, I think. Stephen King came out with about 110-page paper called On Writing.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think
yeah. And I remember I got a hold of an old PDF manuscript of that, and across the top he wrote, "Don't write bullshit," on the very first page. And that spoke volumes to me at the end of the day. I said, okay, this is where the authenticity aspect, comes in. So yeah, it's they're a different lot out there, but they're all super talented in their own way. Ken Follett was actually, when he wrote The Eye of the Needle, I think I was a major, or I was a captain at the time in the Army, junior officer. And he talked about this major who was a military attaché in Paris. And I had no idea who those people were. I didn't even know about that entire field of work. And that sort of piqued my interest, if you will, in just going down that path. Now, I will say, Follett's, of course, a master at the game, and he's received multiple big-time awards. But he's a bit different of a writer. His chapters are longer, they're more dense, and if you really want to go on a saga or an odyssey almost, then I think Ken Follett's your man these days, if you will. We lost you, Craig.
Oh,
there we go. Wait.
Yeah, sorry. I think your chapters are shorter, on the shorter end, right? So you
they are
emulated more of the Patterson and Dan Brown style,
and it allows for more agility. If you need to switch something up, or you just need to insert some thoughts into a given scene. I mean, I've written chapters that are a page long, and I've written others, of course, that are 6 or 7 pages long. But if you realize, you know what, I didn't quite bridge this properly, so let me insert this particular scene right here, and it's, as long as it still meets Patterson's, admonition to keep pushing that story forward, then it's good to go.
It's interesting though, because when I think about the way that those, well, at least the Dan Brown books were structured, it's every chapter sort of ended on that cliffhanger, and the next one would sort of follow along. If you were to insert something in between, though, it would sort of break that pattern. You'd almost have to then fix it a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
and I'd say more in the sense of a piece of information that's value added.
Oh, okay. So insert it into a chapter.
Yes, it has to be
Right.
value added, without a doubt. And you can also do that with I don't even know what to call it in the writing world, the three little dots to separate a different, there you go, the different section, right? Of the, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're keeping your paragraph short in general, then yeah, adding in something isn't going to overly complicate things. If you're already writing lengthy chapters that are really dense, it might be a bit harder to sort of then go and insert stuff, and then you're worried about, okay, now it's getting even more dense.
Indeed.
But yeah, I think for thrillers that really keeps the action moving, and I think it's a really useful way. It's almost like a different kind of thriller than something that is a slower pace, because it's I guess there's different things. There's psychological thrillers and there's military thrillers.
Indeed.
And there's action, adventure, and all that stuff. And I think, yeah, with this kind of espionage, often running around and chases and whatever, the short paragraphs really work well.
Yeah, and I would say my thrillers basically fall into international, global, military, and political. Those sort of four. Some of like my second book's quite a bit political, much more than say the first or the other two are as well. So.
I was going to well, your books have been published fairly recently. I was talking to another author who was releasing a science fiction book about zombies that happened to be like, oh, they all got caused by vaccines. And he got into so much difficulty in 2020 actually trying to market his book because it got wiped from the algorithm and it got
listen, that's a great point, Roland. It's funny. I think when I came out with Major Jake Forina and the Tier 1 Threat in 2022, I was challenged by Amazon initially because they do have these algorithms. And even though it's fiction, for Pete's sake, it's not my commentary on that particular topic. And I'm not trying to stir up a bunch of political dust here. I'm just trying to write a story, right?
Yeah.
So no, that's absolutely correct. And every once in a while, in fact, it happened to me again. I forgot what it was. I was doing an ad or something just about 10 days ago, and they go, "Oh yeah, we've disapproved your blah blah." So they said you can appeal it. And I go, "Really? Okay." Well, I appealed it, and then they approved it, which tells me the algorithm said no. And then a human being looked at it and said, "Okay, this is what this is actually about," sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. You talk about the global political stage and stuff like that, and you realize that even fiction stories can have can tip the scale, so to speak, and also be subject to censorship and
well, 100%. And I think Vital Mission, my fourth book, if it was written on, let's say, farther Eastern Europe, it wouldn't make the cut either.
Yeah.
Right, no way. So
thank goodness for the First Amendment.
That's right, indeed. 100%.
So are you saying like that the algorithm is looking at it and saying, oh, this is like political content and needs to be
there are
certain or hidden or
so-called I think I don't know how, let's say Facebook I'm just using Facebook. I'm sure there are others out there like this, classifies as certain social issues that go against their public policy. And you could, some of them are understandable. Let's just take a horrifically terrible one like child pornography or something like that. I could see, hey, be all over that for sure. But if you're talking about, an adversary who's crafting a virus, to do you in big time, then, that's a story that could potentially happen from a national security perspective. And it doesn't mean I'm writing a commentary about whether or not people should be vaccinated. That's not what this is about. So I think when things got crazy and the misinformation got out of hand and, who knows why, but some of these new policies come into effect, and you just got to be careful. I have some folks I'm working with. One young lady was doing some research for a murder mystery party, and she was on ChatGPT asking about certain murder weapons, and she got banned from ChatGPT. And then her father, who was on his account, he's a big time. He needs chat. He's in the whole, Hollywood side of the industry. He tried to challenge it. Hey, it was for a murder mystery. He goes, now you're really banned. So I don't know what happened on that deal, but that's the kind of thing that you just have to be careful with these days, and can be frustrating if you're trying to do something that's rather innocuous at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Brave new world, isn't it?
Indeed. 100%, especially with all the AI stuff going on at the present time. So,
but I mean, how long ago did you think about becoming a writer? Because it makes it seem like you just decided about it, but I mean, it sounds like you've got a lot of things you want to say, and this is the opportunity to be able to say them. And so,
I think it probably came from, I don't know, two motivations. Number one, I was always a great reader. I read a lot, and I remember reading about Louis L'Amour, the old American country.
Oh, I love Louis L'Amour.
Remember him? Great guy, great writer, wrote some great stuff of Americana. When he was in his early 20s, he read 100 books a year for like 5 or 6 years. And I remember reading, I think it was a biography, might have been a memoir about him. And all those books every year, like, 1956, I read these 110 books, and they're all listed there. And he was doing this while he was jumping, merchant marine ships or whatever. So I was a fairly prolific reader, and I thought I had some good back, and I had some decent experiences as well. And then at one point in the Department of Defense with my job, I could see the handwriting on the wall that I wasn't going to get to where I wanted to go to next, quite frankly. That's just how that happened. And I said, okay, well, you know what? I've been thinking in the back of my mind that I got a story to tell about Paris, my defense attaché job there. And so I said, all right, I'm going to start down that path. And that's just kind of how that happened. It's like, okay, this door's been closed, and I'm going to go through this one now and see where this leads to. And it's perhaps a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's how I got going, and then started down the novel side as well. I
would say everybody who's ever lived in Paris has a Paris story in them.
There you go. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing of Ernest Hemingway saying it's a movable feast, and there we go. So
no question. Loved it. Was there for almost 4 years, and it was just a fantastic time.
And you have a fifth book that you're working on, or it's already done?
The fifth book has got about I'm probably within 50 pages of the finish line. I've got written about 230, 240, something like that, and I'm just kind of making sure I'm taking it to a very good ending, and I'm not going to let it go unless it's it is authentic and hopefully as good as everything else I've written in the past. And it's going to take place in Sicily, and it's going to be called the Sicilian Nexus, because when I worked in the counterterrorism realm, we all understood that counterterrorism is about fighting a nexus of those who are trying to fight us, and that is not just the terrorists themselves, but private governments, businesses, organized crime in a big way works with terrorists, of course. And so, and I had been to Sicily before. In fact, I was there right after the terrible bombings in the mid to 1990s, where they killed Judge Falcone and Borsellino, those two judges, counterterrorism judges that were there. So I knew a little bit about that, and so anyway, that's where we're going to go with book 5.
Oh, I'm excited to hear that one as well. There we go.
Thank you.
Do you find that you've improved over time, with each book? Are you learning stuff that you can sort of put into the next book in terms of your skill set as a writer, or what you find that people are relating to? Or
I think I've gotten better, Craig. I would hope I have. I know many of my readers have said that, and they talk about my growth as a writer from like book 2 to book 3. But that said, it's a tough deal. You to get, to really do it well. I have a very good editor who's really helpful in helping me. And I catch it more myself now, not writing in the passive voice, because every once in a while I want to do that, and I'll revert back to my old self, and she'll catch it and say, hey, this is better to said this way in this direct voice. And so it's a constant battle, making sure I'm remembering that rather than just, spewing stuff down on a page. But yeah, I would hope so with each book. We get better, and we get, I think, better in terms of learning what to leave out of the book rather than putting something in the book. And that's an old Patterson thing too, that you have to grow into over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the hardest things as a writer, is being able to trust your reader to read between the lines, so you don't have to actually spell everything out for them.
Indeed. Absolutely. And there are some times when in this realm, you face the dilemma of not overstating something, not saying too much, and not insulting the reader's intelligence, where in other cases, people may not have the first clue about what you're talking about. So you want to give them just enough to say, okay, here's what you need to know to understand this situation. And that's always in the back of my mind as well.
I think that's...
I mean, I think we've written, I think, Roland, you've written a couple blogs about that topic specifically, the idea of, what you shouldn't put in or writing too much. And it is one of the really tricky things.
It is.
Especially when you're writing for different kinds of audiences where, they, like you said, some will have a lot of information and some won't have any, especially if they've read, like I imagine your books are all sort of standalone. You could read book 4 before you read book 4. So at that point, you have to also think, okay, do I need to include information in here for people that are starting here, but that isn't going to annoy the people that have read all of them?
That's exactly right. That's a very touchy thing. And you're 100% right, Craig. There are a few instances, maybe done in 2 or 3 paragraphs in different places, where I try to catch people up to a degree that they need to be caught up about something. But that's it, and no more. Let's continue on with our current story, sort of thing, And of course, just the challenge between too much exposition and explaining, and not enough dialogue and scene setting and all that kind of stuff. So it's always there, and it's a constant balance.
I mean, it's very interesting you say that your books are written to be sort of standalone, which is what they should be. I mean, like, one of the things we love about the Jack Reacher books is you can literally take any one of those 25 books and you'll have a cracking good read, even if you know nothing about Jack Reacher. And then if you do, then you get more out of it. But every single book can be read on its own, out of order, and it doesn't matter. It's still a cracking good read.
Right on. Exactly.
So, yeah, I think actually we are approaching the top of the hour, unfortunately, in terms of the Psychologist Hour. But I wanted to ask Craig if you had any more questions for Rick. And also, Rick, we should have you back at some point, because I think there are many different avenues we could continue to mine.
Would love to be back anytime, gentlemen. Anytime.
Yeah, no further questions. I mean, like I said, this is the kind of thing that's really interesting when you talk to, any number of authors. You get any number of perspectives, but thrillers, I mean, they're so popular. There's so many different types of thrillers, and they're approached in so many different ways. So it's always really, for me, it's interesting to talk to different authors and about the way that they've done it. And I like, the idea of watching some of those masterclasses. I've always thought to myself that I wanted to watch some of them, but I haven't ever done it myself, and it sounds like they're worthwhile, because especially some of those guys were Patterson and Dan Brown.
The beauty of those master classes, real quick, Craig, is that you could just go at your own pace, quite frankly. And you could take notes all day long. I think Patterson's was in 12 sections, and they would vary from 6 minutes to 14, and would stop and write stuff down and go back and refer to it and all that sort of thing. And I think they're pretty much all that same sort of category, production, if you will.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is being able to learn from other authors. We're learning from people like Patterson and Dan Brown. They put out these master classes, but that's the whole point of our podcast as well, is being able to learn from other authors that are more sort of in your peer group, and what they've picked up along the way. So thanks for coming and sharing your story.
Sure. I appreciate it. And if folks want to know where they can find my stuff,
that was going to be my question. Where can they find more about your books and more about you?
The easiest way, Roland, is Rick, RickSteinke, ricksteinke.com. It's simple as that. And it's all right there. All the books are there. The podcasts are there. I've got a video clip on there now about the first book. So yeah, ricksteinke.com will get you where you need to go.
That sounds fantastic. Well, we will make sure to put a link to that down in the description of this video. So make sure that you scroll down, click on that link, and find out more about Rick and more about Rick's incredible writing. But at the same time, as you go down there, you will pass that big empty comment section. So leave Rick a comment and let him know how much you've appreciated everything he's had to share with us today. And we really appreciate everything you've shared with us, Rick. While you're down there, folks, there is that subscribe button if you haven't already. There's that like button you should smash, as the kids say. And finally, there is a bell icon. If you click on that, you will get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked. And of course, there will be a brand new episode of Fully Booked next week. So until then, cheerio.
Cheerio, gentlemen. Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate it.